freedom then means political freedom. It means the ability to elect your own leaders. It meant to be free from slavery, from the patrician. It meant there was no longer one person, a king, a rex, or one group, the patrician, to be in control. Now that's the philosophical view of Roman freedom. The reality was very few people controlled the state because the plebeians themselves began to have gradations of power. So very powerful families in the plebeian class became part of the government. And of course, they didn't want anybody else to be part. And so they ensured that they controlled the political system. So one of the key words, liberty. Most of our coins have that word on it. But what does liberty mean? Well, it's a hard thing to describe, but basically it comes down, it means freedom. And what does freedom mean? Well, again, it's a hard term to describe or define, but usually it means absence of slavery. So we sit here and say, well, we're not slaves, right? But think about it, you are. How many of you have a cell phone? See, you're a slave, right? How often do you pull that thing out to check, just for the sake of a message or whatever? So you might say, well, no, it really gives me freedom, which is true. Back in the old days, when I was a college student, back before the 20th century or whatever, we had what were called landlines. Most of you probably don't know what those are, but those are basically the old household telephones. And we were a slave to them because if you wanted to go out with your friends, you had to wait till they called. And where did they call? On the landline. And you had to be in your room to receive the call. You couldn't be walking around having a good time and then meeting up. So slavery, we all are, and freedom, or the ability or the absence of slavery, we all have as well. And so it's good to sort of kind of get our idea of what did the Romans mean by it. Well, Rome had a long history of freedom. The founders of Rome and these little babies here being suckled by the she-wolf, Romulus and Remus, were basically free to establish their own state after they killed their grandfather, or their granduncle, by the way. But that's okay. They were, being a corrupting influence. But the story is that the she-wolf found the young twins and suckled them and gave them livelihood, or in the Romans concept, again, freedom. Well, freedom comes from the Latin liber, or libera, and we usually do freedom as libertas. And libertas was a central theme for the Romans. It was the Roman goddess Libera or the Roman god Liber. And for the Romans, what did this mean, this freedom? Well, like us, it had different meanings. There was the personal. There was the personal freedom. That is, they were absent from being a slave. But then there was also the public persona. And that, the two really do connect. The public persona was the idea that they could elect their own representative. In other words, libertas meant that the Roman citizen was in control of his own politics. It's not really our idea of freedom. To the Romans, in terms of personal freedom, there were two particular signs. One is the cap, and we'll talk about that in a minute, Peleus, and the other is the rod, the vindicta, or the festuca. If any of you have an old Liberty dime, pre-1945, see Liberty there? On the back is the Roman fasces. This is the rod and axe. This was a symbol of a Roman magistrate, a Roman official. And these rods here, which could be used for beating a person, that was part of their power, also meant that it was the rod that would give freedom. And the idea is that if you had a slave, you would bring the slave, and you wanted to give the slave his freedom, you would bring the slave to a Roman magistrate. And there, in front of the Roman magistrate, you would declare their freedom. And the Roman magistrate would take one of these rods and tap them on the head, thereby signifying to the rest of the Roman state that Rome had given freedom to this individual. The pileus was the cap that this new slave wore. And as a freeman, they would wear this cap as a sign of honor. Politically, the term pileus was also used to designate this. This is a quote from Diodorus, who was a Roman historian, about Prusias. Prusias is a Greek king who lives in around the year 170 BC. And he says that once, for example, visited by a Roman embassy, he laid aside his insignia of royalty, the diadem purple, in imitation of a newly emancipated freedman at Rome. And he went to meet the envoys with his shaven head, wearing a white cap. That is the pileus, a toga and Roman shoes. In other words, he declared that he was a freedman of the Romans. So here you have a foreign king acting in the side of a freedman. We see in the Republic also you have comedy and satire where the freemen are made fun of, and they're always designated by wearing this cap. But we really see it best in the representations of art. And that's where we really do get the idea of what a Roman viewed the pileus. This is an example from the 4th century BC. This is a common sight. Notice that it is white. The pileus was a felt hat. And it was worn with pride. So for an ex-slave to attain that status was a mark of stature. Because you have to remember that in the Roman world, at least, slavery was very common. Slavery had nothing to do with race, ethnicity. It had to do with you were unfortunate. You either were born a slave or you were captured as a slave. You could be a freeman walking around one day and a Roman army come into your town, defeat your army, defeat your citizens. You're all hauled off as slaves. You could have been a wealthy individual. Now you're a slave. Now, within the slave system, there were gradations. There were those who worked out in the fields. The likelihood of you ever being free was only in one instance, death. That was your freedom. If you were a household slave, you might incur the favor of the owner. He might set you free, especially on his deathbed. Typically, if you were an industrious slave, meaning that you knew economics, you knew business, you knew how to read and all, you might be given your freedom after being a teacher to the master's children. Or you might even be set up as a household accountant, business individual. If you had good acumen of being a businessman, you might be set free, and in fact, the owner might then turn around and give you backing so that you could start your own company. He, of course, would take 50% of the proceeds. But you were free. Unlike modern society, by modern I mean post-1500, to me everything after 476 AD is current history, so I mean, to be honest. But if you look at post-Roman period, slavery was very much an institution that you really did not see many manumissions or set free. But in the Roman world, it was common. More importantly, if you were free, you had the rights of a citizen. You became a Roman citizen. And this meant you had rights in the political world. And your children, in fact, could become magistrates. Those individuals who carried that rod and axe, meaning that your children at least could become part of the government. So our notion of slavery is very different than slavery in the ancient world, just like our notion of freedom. Perhaps the more important aspect, though, is the public persona of liberty. And in architecture, we see the celebration of the gods and goddesses of Libertas and Liber taking place on the Aventine Hill. And the first constructed temple to Libertas is in 238 BC. But why the Aventine? Well, again, if we look back at the notion of what freedom is, it gives us this idea. This is looking from the Aventine Hill in Rome towards the center of Rome. If you ever go to Rome, this is the monument to Victor Emmanuel. It's sort of it gives you a mark. It's an ugly monument, by the way, but you know it's there. The archaeologists like myself would love to tear it down and see what's underneath it, because that was the center of ancient Rome. But you know you can't do that. But anyway, we're looking now down from the Aventine. But why the Aventine? Why was that so important? Well, let's go back to the early Republic. To give you just a very brief history, in 509 BC, the Romans kicked out the last king, and they established the Republic. But we have to understand that the Republic was in the hands of a few families, powerful families. They were called the patricians. Though 99% of the rest of the population, you and me, were plebes, or from the plebeian class. And early on, all power was concentrated in the hands of the patricians, and the plebes were abused. Physically, politically, economically. And so, early on, when the plebeians wanted to gain some sort of control, they had to use their numbers. Now, they did not go to open warfare, but instead, they were smart about it. Typically, the Roman army was composed of 90% plebeian, 10% patricians. And so when the enemy arrived one time, the plebeians said, you know, we're not going to fight. They succeeded from the Roman army. And they went up to here, the Aventine Hill, the largest hill in Rome, highest. And they just sat there. So if you have an army of 10,000, and you're facing an army of 10,000, you got, odds are you might win. But if 90% of your army has just walked off the battlefield, what are you going to do if you're a patrician? Well, you're going to, first of all, decide we can run away, which doesn't look good, or we can give in to their demands. And so they said to the plebes, what do you want? Well, one of the first things they said is, start writing your laws down. Every time we come to you, you say, no, you can't do that. It's against the law. But then the next week we come and said, well, you just said it was against the law. Well, there's this other law that we didn't tell you about. They said, write the laws down. Okay, what else? And they said, quit beating us physically. Let us have a trial. Okay, fine. So they went back down, they fought, they won. A couple years later, the next army came in. The plebes went back up to the Aventine and they said, okay, what do you want now? Well, we want to have these offices that you all control. We want to be part of it. They said, well, okay, you can get elected. No. We want guarantees. The Romans had a system of duality. There were two consuls. Those were the chief political leaders. They said, one of them has to be a plebe. Fine, we'll do it. So they came down. After about 50 years of this, the plebeians actually gained freedom, political freedom. They now had a variety of political rights. And because they always went up to the Aventine Hill in Rome became their spot. Just like across the field was the Palatine Hill. And the Palatine Hill was where the patricians had their spot. If you go to Rome today, this is looking down towards the Tiber River. That's the Tiber River. So we're looking up from the Tiber to the Palatine. But if you go there to Rome today, the Aventine Hill and the Palatine Hill are separated by the Great Circus Maximus, which really was the melting spot for the Romans. That's where 200,000 Romans could scream and shout for their favorite chariot driver. So it was a very symbolic place. So the Roman view of freedom then means political freedom. It means the ability to elect your own leaders. It meant to be free from slavery, from the patricians. It meant that there was no longer one person, a king, a rex, or one group, the patricians, to be in control. Now that's the philosophical view of Roman freedom. The reality was very few people controlled the state, because the plebeians themselves began to have gradations of power. So very powerful families in the plebeian class became part of the government. And of course, they didn't want anybody else to be part. And so they ensured that they controlled the political system. Very few people like you and me would make it into the politics. I mean, you know, how many of you are in politics? We got one. So out of 52%, that's about the norm. But from the concept of the philosophy, though, the Romans believed that this freedom meant that they had a voice. I showed you that statue of the she-wolf. Well, here's the she-wolf now. And anybody have an idea what this is? It's kind of hard to see. It's a bull. A bull is trampling a she-wolf. This is the Italian Oscan coin celebrating their victory over the Romans in the Civil War, because the Romans had subjugated the Italians. And the Italians said, we want our freedom. And so during the war in the late 1st century BC, the social war, the Italians fought against the Romans. They were allies originally. And this was the worst war that Rome ever faced. Why? Because they were fighting themselves. I mean, if you look back in our history, what was our worst war? Civil War, because we were fighting ourselves. And the same here. In the end, the Oscans lost on the battlefield, but won politically. They were free from the Romans, they were equal. All of this changes, however, with Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was from a noble family, a patrician family, although he later said he was really from a plebeian family. And he was, because he came from both two sides. That gave him access to both the plebes and the patricians. Julius Caesar was not, early in his age, was not what you would call an ideal individual. He was a drunkard, he was a womanizer, a gambler, always broke, always dreaming of the future. And when he was 33, another general by the name of Pompey arrives from the east in great triumph. And Julius Caesar kind of looked at himself and said, I'm 33. What did Alexander do when he was 33? Well, Alexander refers to Alexander the Great. At the age of 33, Alexander the Great was dead, but he had conquered the known world. And Julius Caesar said, look at me. So he changes. First thing he does is he stops drinking. Then he kind of cleans up his family life. There was once a scandal where his wife was supposedly involved in an affair, so he divorced her, even though she had not done anything. But Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. He then makes an agreement with two individuals, Pompey being one, another General Crassus, and the three of them divide the Roman world. They end political freedom. They decide who are going to be the magistrates. A few years later, after Crassus has died in battle, Caesar defeats Pompey, and Caesar becomes dictator. Now, we have a negative connotation for dictator, right? If we say that somebody's a dictator, we have this image of Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin. To the Romans, the term dictator actually was a very honorable term. That was a magistrate. It meant that in times of great crisis, the Romans would elect a dictator. And that dictator would serve for 6 months, and either at the end of successful solving of the problem, or at the end of 6 months, whichever came first, the dictator would resign. He could be reelected. The most famous dictator, there were a couple, but the most famous dictators in Rome, one was a man by the name of Cincinnatus, back in the 400s. He had saved Rome from the invading Gauls. Another was Fabius Maximus during the war with Hannibal. Anybody know who Hannibal was? Carthaginian general, nearly defeated the Romans. He was a dictator who basically held off Hannibal by not engaging him. So Caesar was elected dictator. But at the end of 6 months, he said, I'm not finished. So he became dictator for a year. And at the end of 9 months, dictator's looking pretty good. He became dictator for 5 years. Well, dictator's not too bad. He ultimately, at the end of the first year of being a dictator, had himself declared dictator for life. Now we're changing topics here, because Caesar now has moved from a constitutional idea to basically what the Romans were most afraid, the idea of a king. And for the Romans, they always had this view that kings were bad. They had had kings in their past history. Romulus was a king. But kings meant somebody who had absolute control. In other words, people did not have liberty. They did not have freedom. And of course, what that meant, political freedom. Caesar, in fact, wanted to be king. And in 44 BC, on his way to the theater of Pompey, where he was to hopefully be made king, he is assassinated. He's assassinated, actually, in the theater. This is the Roman reaction to assassinating. But we have to understand, who did the assassination of Caesar? Was it the plebes? No. They were very happy with Julius Caesar. He gave them peace. He gave them security. He gave them jobs. He gave them free grain, free food. The plebes were very happy, because after a century of civil war, finally, it looked like we were coming out of disaster. The people who were opposed to Caesar were the patricians, the ones who had held those political offices, the ones who had been consuls, praetors, and whatever. They were now being shut out of the government. Marcus Junius Brutus, descended from the first Brutus who had kicked out the king of Rome, assassinated Caesar. This is a coin of Brutus, a very rare coin. If you ever find one, keep it. Get about $50,000 for it. What's that cap? That's the Peleus. Those are the two daggers. They're slightly different. It's hard to tell, but they are slightly different. They're Italian daggers from different parts of Italy. You might not be able to read this, but it's EID.MAR. Anybody have an idea? When was Caesar killed? On the Ides of March. And then that's Brutus. You can see that by BRUTUS. Brutus issues a coin celebrating the assassination of Caesar, showing that he has given back freedom to the Romans on the Ides of March. And in fact, when he leaves the theater of Pompey, he says to the Romans, "You have been given your freedom back. The tyrant is dead." And he hoped, he expected that they would act like the descendants back, the ancestors back in 509. Hooray, we have our freedom. Instead, the plebes just kind of stood there and said, "Well, we like Caesar. He was a nice guy." Another kind of Brutus, you can tell it's Brutus because he puts his name there. These are the officials. Remember that set fasces, see? That's the rod and axe, the symbol of a Roman magistrate who gives freedom to a slave. And there's libertas. So Brutus's view is that he has given back freedom. But the Roman people don't want it. They don't need it, they say. You then have the rise of Julius Caesar's nephew. His name is Octavian, don't need to worry about that. His real name, he later changes his name to Augustus. Augustus, after 15 years of civil war, finally wins, and he establishes the res publica. He reestablishes it. But he didn't. Augustus destroys it. Why? Because while he is smarter than Caesar in terms of politics, he knows not to use the term king. He holds all the power. It's a military dictatorship. It is the end of political freedom. And we have to understand that that's what the plebes wanted. They didn't care anymore about the political freedom. What they cared about was security. Security from having armies march through their farmlands, march through their homes. Augustus, this is a famous statue of Augustus. It's in the Vatican if you go. The nice thing about it is that it shows him as a military general. This little guy down here, that's freedom. That's libertas. But he's showing, see, he has restored libertas. The Republic is no longer needed, although we will call it the Republic for the next 1,000 years. It's no longer needed. And the reason why it's no longer needed is because he has brought peace and security. To the Romans now, libertas morphs into a different idea. We see this in Augustus' official name. Imperator Caesar Divi Filius Augustus. If you ever want a good name, this is one. What is Imperator? Anybody have an idea? Emperor. What does emperor mean? No. That's rest. We don't want to see. We don't use the word king.
Ruler?
Close. All-conquering general. Not a bad first name, right? Caesar. Well, that refers back to Julius Caesar. Everybody refers to Julius Caesar. Caesar was declared a god. And so he's Caesar Divi Filius. Filius means son of the divine Caesar. Can any of you claim divinity? He could. He was the adopted son of Julius Caesar, therefore he was his son, and therefore he was the son of a god. Augustus. Anybody know what Augustus means? Take off the last two. August. What does August mean? You want to say a month, but it's not. Anyway?
Peace.
What's that?
Peace.
Close. Savior. All-conquering general, son of the god Caesar, Savior of the Roman world. Now, if you want a name, pick that one. Because I'll tell you, no one can ever top that. Because basically it meant that he was a god. And he commemorates this by issuing a coin here with Divus Julius, the divine Caesar, puts it here, there, puts up a little star, because the way they commemorated Julius Caesar was that when Caesar's body was burned, a comet flew across the sky. And they said, see, Caesar is being carried into the heavens. So Augustus claims that he is the Son of the Divine, and he has brought peace and security. And that is what was important to the Romans. The idea that peace returns after a century of war. So, under the empire, liberty now means no longer freedom to elect their own officials. It meant freedom to be happy or successful in business and life. All of the offices are now controlled by the emperor. People want peace. What is more important to them was security. They are willing to give up political control for that type of peace. We might look at that as alien. But think about it. How much are you willing to give up for peace and security? Back in 1938, Neville Chamberlain returns from Berchtesgaden with a piece of paper declaring peace in our time, because he is willing to give up the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, to Hitler, just so that we don't have war. 1914, the German army moves through Belgium. If the Germans had known that Belgium had a secret treaty with England, they wouldn't have gone through it. The secret treaty was signed a century earlier, guaranteeing freedom. There, the Brits did live up to it. The result was the First World War with close to 50 million dead. So where do we draw the line in our own lives? Well, for the Romans it was simple. They were tired. They were tired of the war. They wanted that peace and security. They wanted free reign, which is what Julius Caesar had given them. They wanted chariot races, plebs and circus, or bread and circus, because it gave them enjoyment. And again, I always come back to your own life. How many of you have cable TV? Well, aren't you a slave to it? Worst thing that can happen is a storm that knocks out your cable TV during NFL games. The Romans were no different. Well, at the end of Nero's reign, Nero was a descendant of Augustus, we have a revolution. A man by the name of Galba marches on Rome, and he brings about libertas, or the republic, or the publica, public liberty. But he's not talking about bringing back freedom for politics. He's talking about bringing back freedom from the insanity of Nero. He's returning some kind of semblance of security for the people after the great fire in Rome that destroyed Rome during Nero's reign, who he blamed the Christians. After his great palace being built. After the building of a great statue of himself. Galba announces that he is returning sanity. What does he have? He's got the goddess Libertas, and there's that cap, that Peleus, the cap of freedom. Not a negative, but rather a positive. He's returning freedom. And in fact, successive emperors would point to this. The next Galba gets killed, by the way. That's all right. I mean, he was loud. But Vespasian becomes emperor. And here you see Bill mentioned public works, useless public works. I always like that. Well, which are better? Private works that are grandiose, or public works for the good of the community? Well, Vespasian would have said public. So he destroys Nero's palace. He bulldozes it. If you go to Rome today, you can actually go in it. It's underground. It was discovered during the Renaissance when artists went down and they saw all these beautiful paintings in the grotto. Hence we get the term grotesque. It comes from grotto. If you go, it's a beautiful, beautiful place. They just opened it about 15 years ago. On top of it, however, he built public baths. Romans like baths, they like to be clean. Wonderful place. The private lake of Nero is drained. And in its place, the Colosseum is built. The statue of Nero still remained, but they called it the god Helios. So, they just changed the name. Okay. So, in other words, Vespasian turned these private pleasures into public pleasures. Antoninus Pius also issues a coin. Now, this is not during a civil war. This is during the great Roman peace, Pax Romana, when Rome was at its height, 160 AD. But again, we have libertas with the Helios, with the cap. In other words, freedom now meant freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom from pain. It means that the emperor has brought peace and security. Well, let's move now 1,700 years ahead, and we get to the period of our founding fathers. And if you read our founding fathers, you suddenly notice that they hate democracy. If you read the Federalist Papers, you have these wonderful arguments against or in favor of a different thing. And they sign it Cato, Brutus, Cassius. These are the very people who opposed Caesar, who opposed his dictatorship. In other words, they were trying to show the connection between the Roman Republic and their own times. And they did not want a democracy. And the reason why they didn't want a democracy was because of this man, Socrates. Not that they hated Socrates. No. They loved Socrates. But what happened to him? Socrates was an Athenian who in the year 397 BC is brought up on charges of corrupting the youth and believing in strange gods in Athens. He is found guilty by the Athenian people. A jury of 501 voted. It came close. It was about 265 to 240, whatever the math turns out to be. And at that point, you enter into the penalty phase. And this is where you see how philosophers, we have one here, but not to denigrate them, but Socrates wasn't too bright as far as public opinion. Each was supposed to give their view of what the penalty should be. Well, the prosecution asked for death. I mean, prosecution always asks for death, right? You steal a loaf of bread, death. Jaywalk, death. So he said death. Socrates came up and said, well, since you found me guilty of speaking the truth and speaking about freedom, you should give me a pension. And I should be given free room and board for the rest of the month. Now understand, he's just been found guilty, right? So the crowd, the jury now votes about 375 to about 125 for death. But for our founding fathers, they viewed this image of the people of Athens killing Socrates. I mean, he deserved it, by the way. I don't mind you. If you're somebody, he said, no, come on. You say, give me a pension and all that. No, he didn't deserve to be found guilty of the first charge, which was corrupting the youth and believing in strange gods. But for insulting the people of Athens, yes, he did. But that's beside the point. But our founding fathers had this view of the rabble, the crowd. That's why they liked the Republic of Rome, because it gave them order. For our founding fathers, the term libertas, liberty, meant political freedom. They wanted the political freedom to decide their destiny. Hence, we have the establishment of the writing of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. But for them, they were hearkening back to the Republic of Rome. So when we look at liberty, we have to understand it changes over time. And it changes based upon one's perception. And it changes based upon your own set of happenings. For the Romans, under the Republic, it meant freedom to decide their political future. And hopefully that's what it means for us. Thank you.